Hello and welcome to my channel. The subject of this video is the Aryan Invasion theory in the Rig Veda. There are a substantial number of quotes in this study. In order not to interrupt the verbal flow, I will not quote them directly, but all of them will be posted for interested parties below. Introduction. When I first picked up the Rig Veda, I did so with a set of preconceived notions. These ideas were more inherited from osmosis and memory fragments of past readings on the Aryan homeland, rather than any digging into this deep stratum of human culture directly. Among other things, I expected to find relics of the Aryan invasion into the Indian subcontinent. I imagined this would be in pieces scattered through the various hymns. Perhaps there would be prayers of thanksgiving to Lord Indra for giving them the land, or to Lord Agni for guiding them through the dark of the mountains with his light. But it was not so. There are no narratives akin to the biblical Book of Joshua or the Viking Icelandic sagas. If one approaches the Vedas with openness and sacrifices time and effort into the fire of their light, they will dispel many illusions. One of them is the Aryan invasion theory. It is simply not there in any clear fashion. The Aryan invasion theory. For those who are unfamiliar with it, the Aryan invasion theory is a 19th century linguistic construct based upon the relationship of Sanskrit to other European languages and Old Persian. It postulates, based upon these similarities, that there was a common point of origin for the people speaking these languages at some undetermined location, and that the Sanskrit-speaking Aryan nomads invaded India sometime around 1500 BC and gradually imposed Vedic culture upon the much larger population of the subcontinent. This population, about whom there is much dispute, was, according to some, the more advanced Indus Valley civilization. This would be a strange reversal of historical precedent. When the Gothic-speaking and Aryan Christian tribes of Germanic Visigoths invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 415 AD and conquered it, they did not remake the native Roman population to match their image. In fact, although they were the ruling elite, they assimilated by learning Latin and becoming Catholic Christians. Why then would the ancient Aryans retain Sanskrit and Vedic rites at all? The Vedas are not primarily historic texts but vehicles of divine truth. But they do contain many facts about the materials culture of the Aryan Confederacy of the Five Tribes, as they called themselves. When these fossils are assembled in the mind, they reveal the skeleton of a culture that was settled and not nomadic. This is a further blow to the theory, which is predicated on barbarians sweeping down from the steppes into the land of the Seven Rivers on the outskirts of the declining Harappan civilization to find their place in the sun, as the Kaiser put it, just as their distant Visigoth cousins would do centuries later. In this video, I'm going to focus on the evidence in the Rig Veda in support of this thesis that the five tribes were a settled people and not invaders, although they were in conflict with their neighbors, whom they called the Dasyus. The material culture of the five tribes. Chronologically, the 10 mandalas composing the Rig Veda are divided into two sections. Those which are considered the oldest, according to Western Sanskritists such as Oldenburg, are called the family books. These are Mandalas 2 through 7. Mandalas 1 and 8 through 10 are later material according to the professors. This is somewhat odd, since there are references to written text in the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th mandalas when these were allegedly a purely oral tradition, but that is beyond the scope of this study. The first step will be to assemble all the data from what are claimed to be the older books and see if the type of material culture we find there is consistent with that of nomads. Much of the information we find along these lines are centered on warfare. Some might argue that this in itself is evidence for a militant and invasive group. Were this supported by clear statements in the Rig Veda reflecting a memory of such an invasion, then it would be correct. But it is not, and the reason is due to the conflicts with the Dasyus. The chariot is referred to frequently, as are specifics about this vehicle, such as the spoked wheel, including details about the wheel, which are the pin of the yoke, the axle, and the bolt of the axle. So it is not a wagon, as some have claimed, as this vehicle is mentioned separately. We also see that economic specialization was associated with the settled culture by references to carpenters who have the skill to bend wood into wheels and to use the plane. It should be pointed out, the effective use of the chariot requires a great investment of time and resources. Such an aristocracy needs to be independent of the demands of a nomadic lifestyle to have the freedom to focus on training to use the chariot. In fact, I am unaware of any nomadic culture in the ancient world that used chariots in warfare. In Joshua 11, we see the nomadic Hebrews were afraid of the chariots they encountered when engaging the more settled Canaanites. Associated with this technology are metal weapons and mailed warriors. While smiths are not directly mentioned in the Rig Veda, obviously they were able to make metal blades and chainmail, which is highly specialized, and both require a smithy. This is generally not a temporary structure. A grindstone is mentioned. There is specific mention of the goldsmith. However, that in itself is not indicative of a developed material culture, since the Andean Indians of Tiwanaku had highly skilled goldsmiths, but they did not have the wheel. The horse is one of the most iconic and important symbols in the Vedas. The horse sacrifice is the pinnacle of the Vedic sacrificial system. In archaeological circles, much debate turns on the subject of the horse in the subcontinent. Looking at the older family books, we find many indications of the technology used in their horsemanship. It was certainly more advanced than that of the nomadic American Indians. Not only did they have the bit and the harness, but the reins, saddle, and bridle as well. Beyond military technology, we find examples of verses where the sages sang of farming. They pray to Lord Agni to grant them plentiful crops, and we also see the mention of the plow. Although, whether this was metal or wood is not clear. We know they grew at least barley. Another prayer we find is for spacious habitations, and in one hymn a prayer for a mansion with 1,000 columns. Pardon me. No doubt this is an exaggeration, but it still reflects ownership of property and real estate. Neither are consistent with nomads. Finally, It should be mentioned that according to notes in some translations, specifically that of Wilson, there was even the use of coined money. When we turn to the later mandalas, we see there is both more data and more details. Following our pattern of looking first at military technology, we see sewn armor and metal axes and helmets, as well as chainmail on chariots. In the agricultural sector, we find that the crops for which the seers were praying were barley and the labor-intensive rice. There is also a verse mentioning the sickle, water trough, and yoke for oxen. There are perhaps half a dozen prayers for a house, described not only as a mansion without defects, but a 3-story house, in one translation, as well as wealth in livestock and land. We find further examples of economic specialization in the mention of a barber with a razor and even wage earners. Tanners also made valuable contributions to warfare, although modern Hindus would not be comfortable with the notion of using cowhides in such a manner. The warriors wore a leather cuirass and had leather guards on their wrist. There are a variety of references in the Rig Veda to dressed hides with ritual uses, including leather vessels to contain the soma, as well as being given as gifts. For example, one of the seers received 100 dressed hides. While it might be argued that there are some advances, the distinction between the material culture of the two parts of the Rig Veda, no matter how removed chronologically, are minimal. This means that, even in the oldest section, the Aryan tribes were well settled in the land of the 7 rivers in northern India at the time of the composition of the Rig Veda. Despite an oral tradition connecting them directly to the fathers who made this path, as they sang, they had no recollection of an aboriginal homeland from an earlier period. If they were not settled, after all, how could they pray for, as they did, the well-being of our towns? They were settled, yes, but not at peace. The enemies of the Vedic seers, the Dasyus. There are 2 and possibly 3 distinctions between the Aryans and the Dasyus in the Rig Veda. There are some, such as Aurobindo, who will argue that the term Aryan is not an ethnic or tribal designation at all, and all discussion of such tribes is in error. According to these people, it means simply noble without any specification. By the time of the Atharva Veda, there is some basis for this, as we see a distinction between the Aryans and the Shudras, or the lower caste. However, even then, it still retains its association with clans and tribes, so it is not used as a designation of social status alone. Further, the term Aryan is defined by a specific set of parameters set in opposition to the term Dasyus. First, the Dasyus were religiously distinct from the 5 tribes. This is repeatedly emphasized in the Rig Veda. The sages prayed explicitly, "May we overcome the Dasyus." They are a hostile tribe without gods and wolves, whom the Devas also regard as foes. Lord Indra destroys the unbelievers, as does Lord Agni and Lord Rudra. The sages prayed to the divine twins, the Ashvins, to behead the unbelievers, and Lord Indra granted this. Lords Mitra and Varuna exterminate them. These statements are not exceptional. They are common throughout the Rig and Sama Vedas, although less frequent by the time of the later Atharva Veda. Interestingly, and Perhaps uncomfortably for some, myself among them, the seers give one detail of the worship of the Dasyus outside of the fact that they were not fire worshippers. Indra destroys the phallus worshippers, we're told. The absence of a clear mention of the worship of Mahadeva in the form of the lingam in the Vedas could reasonably support the argument that it is the lingam as we know it that is here anathematized, especially since the lingam is found in the Harappan ruins. But more on this subject later. Second, the Dasyus did not seem to speak Sanskrit, as they were described as being linguistically different from the Aryans. The Rig Veda calls them babbling unbelievers, who are confounded by Lord Agni. This leads us to the most controversial aspect of this argument, ethnic distinction. This is always played down in modern political correct orthodoxy. In some verses, the Dasyus are described as black people. This may have been a moral judgment, and there is considerable linguistic analysis of these terms to question whether these are really statements of skin color prejudice at all. We must bear in mind that despite some abuse of statements about the appearance of devas and questionable translation of these mantras used as propaganda on crackpot white supremacist sites, the ancient Aryans were not white as we perceive that ethnic designation. The proof of this is the prayer of one sage for, as he says, a tawny-hued sun. But there may have been minor differences of appearance between the two groups, which were something akin to those of modern Swedes and Sicilians in the context of the Caucasian race. There is also a theory that the Dasyus may have been a heterodox sect, but not different from the Aryans in any other way. There is one verse which argues against this. It is a statement that the Devas killed 2 Aryans who acted without faith and dignity. This turns on the meaning of faith, but it may suggest that they did not conform to the Vedic cult and thus were regarded as outsiders religiously. But even so, they did not lose their identity as Aryans. This implies that the Dasyus must have been more than simply nonconformist. I have to wonder if the Dasyus were not connected to the Indus Valley civilization as either the people themselves or they simply occupied these buildings at some point in time. This is because Lord Indra is said to have overthrown 100 stone-built cities. And the Dasyus had forts of iron, not literally but poetically, meaning that they were indestructible. The same is said of the cities, that they were iron. This reminds me of the Goths, when they rampaged through the Eastern Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, but since they had no siege technology, they famously said, "We are at peace with walls." There is even mention of a stone cowfold associated with the Asuras, but this could be using the word Asura in the way Allied propaganda in World War II referred to the Germans as demons, not meaning that it was the actual etheric species who had these cowfolds. Continuing with this topic and returning to the verses condemning the Dasyus as phallus worshippers, do such artifacts as the Harappan lingam support the idea that there were Dasyus and the worship of the Shiva lingam is not only not Vedic, but directly condemned by the seers? We know the Dasyus did not worship the sacred fire of Lord Agni, and yet, according to many archaeologists, fire altars have been found in Harappan ruins. This would indicate that they were not the Dasyus, and therefore the lingam found there is not the phallus worship to which the Rig Veda concerns. This would lead us back to ask if the Dasyus might have been the original Harappans who were gradually replaced, since there is no evidence of occupation, or converted to Vedic civilization with some traditionalist associated with the lingam resisting the change. The archaeologists are not settled on these points, and there is clearly still much to discover to fully construct an accurate picture. Personally, I am not convinced either way, and people of goodwill can certainly reasonably disagree on these matters. Whomever the Dasyus may have been, be it a distinct cultural group or a heretical sect, the Aryans of the land of the Seven Rivers were clearly in conflict with them. This is not a symbolic construct. We see this in many verses, such as the desire to inflict pain on the foe, and that Lord Indra is the slayer of the Dasyus. There are some who will see such verses as indicative of conquest and occupation, thus actually supporting the Aryan invasion theory. But when we read the hymns consistently, we begin to notice that the spoils of war, for which the seers often petition the devas, are not territory. Overwhelmingly, most of the conflict portrayed in the Rig Veda is that of cattle and horse raiding. What they prayed for most is to be given the enemy's cows, not their kingdoms. This is not what one expects to hear from invaders who have come to occupy the subcontinent. It is what is absent that is most striking. While the Dasyus were regarded as unbelievers, as were the Canaanites of the Near East in the eyes of the Hebrew tribes, there is no mandate from the devas to go and occupy their territory or to purify the subcontinent from their cults, lest Lord Indra be offended. When Jehovah speaks on this point, he is clear. Quote, "See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it, as the Lord God, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." End quote. There are no such verses as these in the Rig Veda. Are we to learn from this that the devas and the seers of the ancient Aryans were simply not like Jehovah and his people, or was the relationship between the 5 tribes and the Dasyus different from that of the Hebrew tribes and the Canaanites? Much later historically, at the time of the Atharva Veda, there are almost no references to raiding and few to the Dasyus. One wonders if they were already a memory by this point. By the end of the Vedic era and Lord Vishnu's avatar as Lord Rama, the Dasyus seemed to be completely absent. These conflicts were settled by then, whatever they may have been. Conclusion. There are many unanswered questions about this period of history. Human knowledge has much further to progress to discover the tertium quid, which will resolve many of the contradictions which plague our understanding. However, at this point, the Aryan invasion theory is clearly not that key, as it was once thought to be, and it does not unlock these riddles. Setting aside archaeology, as I have since it is outside the subject of this study, if it cannot be found and have a solid basis in these texts, then it is simply not there. It is an idol with feet of clay. Thank you.